Welcome to the Capital News. I am your host, Alex Correitis. Today's October 22nd, 2019. Thank you so much for joining me. So the title of today's podcast is Brexit. When will it end? I have no idea. And neither does anybody else. The politicians in the UK have no clue. The politicians and the bureaucrats within the European Union have no clue. Market analysts, currency traders, everybody and their mother. Nobody has any idea when this Brexit saga is going to end. Now, I told you multiple times in very recent podcasts that I'm not going to do any type of deep dive into Brexit, but there were a couple big votes that took place today, so we are going to focus on that a little bit. I'm going to take the time to read an article from the BBC, and we're going to discuss that a little bit. But like I've been saying in previous podcasts, at the beginning of this podcast and its format from February of this year, when we thought that the first hard deadline for Brexit being at the end of March, we took that seriously. We thought, okay, you know what? They've had 2.5 years because the referendum vote took place in, June of 2016. So now we're beyond 3 years. Well, we figured, okay, well, that was plenty of enough time for the Brits to figure this out. The people spoke. It's what they wanted. And now it's incumbent upon the politicians within the UK to come up with an agreement, if you can, obviously with each other and with your counterparts in the European Union. That turned out to be a colossal mistake. A colossal cluster is what it was. And so, we took the time here on this podcast on an almost nearly daily basis to discuss the nitty-gritty when it came to Brexit, what was going on, why I thought it was important. I still think it's important because this was a vote by the people to say, you know what, enough's enough. We want to reclaim our sovereignty. There are things that we can do as the British people that we don't need to have this membership into the European Union to achieve. We can still have a lot of things, but we don't have to pay all of this money to the European Union. We don't have to have these politicians and bureaucrats who we have no idea who they are making decisions that have a large influence on our social fabric, on our economic affairs, and a whole host of things. They said, no, we want to reclaim our sovereignty, and I applaud that. And that's why I was focusing on that so much early on in the existence of this podcast. But now, since, they kick the can down the road, politicians are the same. It doesn't matter if you're in Washington, D.C., or if you're in London, or if you're in Hong Kong. It makes no difference where you are. All politicians are virtually the same. They just have different names, different style of clothing. That's about it. So we've been taking a step back and saying, you know what, we'll talk about it briefly. If it's just a continuation of kicking the can down the road, that's where we're going to leave it. If there is a bigger vote, we'll discuss it, and that's what we've been doing. So there were some bigger votes. Obviously, some took place over the weekend. A couple big votes took place today, so that's what we're going to discuss a little bit. But we have no idea when this is going to end, and neither does anybody else for that matter. We're obviously going to cover some market news. We're going to talk about the meeting briefly between President Erdogan of Turkey and President Putin of Russia. Those two are chumming it up. They seem to be some pretty good buddies, which is interesting, and we're going to discuss that. And to kick things off, we're going to continue talking about Boeing, but very briefly because we've been highlighting Boeing on a handful of very recent podcasts, and I think rightly so because I think this could be something that turns into potentially a catalyst. Now, I hope I'm wrong in saying that. I really do, because if there is a big problem in Boeing, that will have cascading effects. Believe me when I tell you, and we've gone through why that can be the case. Now, at the same time, when you're a company that is really dealing with life and death, if they did mess up, then I have to say, we'll see you later, or you're going to have to go through those pains, all on your own there. The sad thing is you're going to bring a lot of people down with it. So we're going to keep you focused on that. But the story that came out today in regards to Boeing was we have Kevin McAllister, who is the head of the 737 unit within Boeing. He was fired today. So Boeing is in damage control. You have the CEO, Muhlenberg. He is set to testify before House panels and Senate panels at the end of this month. He is the CEO of Boeing. He was formerly the CEO and the chairman, but they stripped the title of chairman from him recently, again, as a means of damage control. But I don't think this is going to be enough. There are some people who are saying the whole board has to go because you can't have this, and a whole host of things. So, again, Boeing is a major U.S. company. It is one of the largest companies on the face of this earth. Okay? Huge, the largest U.S. exporter. They are interconnected within the global supply chain. Pay attention. We have Texas Instruments. I'm just noting Texas Instruments, another U.S. company, because it is earnings season. But they reported after the bell today, and in after-hours trading, they were down about 11%. And they were down about 11% because they missed on earnings, and they gave very poor, very weak forward guidance. Now, everybody was thinking, well, the semiconductor industry, well, they're turning a corner. They're turning a corner. And you know why everybody thought they were turning a corner? Of course, I didn't. But you know why? Because we're going to start selling soybeans. And you understand that, don't you? If we start selling more soybeans, then clearly we're going to have to start selling more semiconductors as well. I mean, this is a bunch of hogwash. I can't even explain it. This is the financial road of Oz. This is worse than sprinkling, Tinkerbell sprinkling pixie dust over somebody. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. You can't. So you have after-hours trading, again, Texas Instruments down 11%, and the other major semiconductor companies trading down as well. We'll see how this carries over to tomorrow, because we're going to have some other big names. I think Microsoft reports. I think Boeing reports tomorrow. So there's going to be some big names coming out. And, of course, Boeing is pretty much overshadowed by what is transpiring here with some internal leaks of some, messages back and forth with some pilots within Boeing who are concerned with the 737 MAX 8 airliner. So a lot to cover for the remainder of this week, and I will be sure to keep you guys posted. So what took place in the markets today? The S&P lost 11 points. The Dow lost 40. The NASDAQ gave back 59 points, and the Russell 2000 was up about 75 cents for the day. The Dow Jones Transports continues to rally and was up 0.9% for the day, and the New York Stock Exchange lost about 0.1% for the day. Again, I am still scratching my head when it comes to the Dow Jones Transports, especially given the Cass Freight Index, which we're probably going to do a podcast on that as well, because they are continuing to see further deterioration within the transportation sector across all modes of transportation, whether it's trucking, whether it's rail, whether it's air, whether it's by sea. All of them. So that's somewhat of a head scratcher. We have oil trading at $54 a barrel. Brent, the international metric, is at $59.50. Gold, relatively unchanged from yesterday, but up slightly, trading at $1,492 an ounce. Silver, relatively unchanged from yesterday's podcast, is at $17.54. Same holds true with the U.S. 10-year Treasury, but slightly down, now yielding 1.77%. And the VIX, the volatility index, was up about 3 percentage points and is now trading at $14.46. So a relatively muted day across the markets, looking for headlines. That's all it is, folks. Everybody is looking for hope. It doesn't matter that the Federal Reserve is continuing to print money on an overnight basis and is continuing to expand their balance sheet, which, well, Nelly, they printed a lot of money last night. But pay no attention to that. There's clearly nothing deteriorating beneath the surface or right on the surface. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Just listen to Donald Trump, Thunder Thumbs, and Larry Kudlow and Brexit talks that everything's going to be okay, that, U.S.-China trade talks are going phenomenally well. Believe all that BS. Pay no attention to what's actually taking place. So these markets, again, are having everybody and everything throwing as much hope at them as possible, and we have still yet to make new all-time highs. But who knows? We very well may in the near term here. So a couple stories, like I said, we're going to talk about. The first one we're going to get to here is another article from the BBC with regards to Turkey and Russia. So we have Turkey-Syria offensive. Erdogan and Putin strike a deal over the Kurds. Turkey and Russia have agreed with what they have called a historic deal aimed at keeping Kurdish forces away from Syria's border with Turkey. Turkey this month launched an offensive to drive out the Kurdish forces from their southern frontier and create, quote, a buffer zone Russia is an ally of Syria's Bashar al-Assad and has raised concern about foreign interference in Syria, probably the United States. Turkey and Russia will now conduct joint patrols on the border. The deal comes after the U.S. announced a sudden and unexpected withdrawal, and analysts see it as cementing Turkish and Russian influence in the region. Now, isn't that interesting? Because you have Turkey, a member of NATO. NATO was created to keep a buffer against Russia. And now you have President Erdogan of Turkey becoming buddy-buddy with Vladimir Putin, president of Russia. Now, I'm all for peace and prosperity here. These endless wars need to come to an end. I'm just talking about what's going on here. I mean, I would like to reach across the aisle and make peace with everybody, including Vladimir Putin. But I'm just telling you, this is what happens when you get involved with these endless wars. This is what happens when you start meddling in other people's affairs. The type of alliance that NATO is, that it's supposed to be a buffer from and against Russia, you now have a member becoming buddy-buddy with Russia. So it just causes interesting dynamics. And it's going to cause people, which was what we have seen, basically in a bipartisan manner, of Democrats and Republicans, former administration officials, whether of the Trump administration or of the Bush administration or the Obama administration, coming out and saying, look, what Donald Trump has done in this regard of this knee-jerk reaction to pull U.S. forces out of Syria, look at what this is causing. And this is going to be another example for them to say, look, you have this NATO ally. I do believe the U.S. actually has nuclear weapons over in Turkey, or at least some very, very powerful weaponry over in Turkey, and yet they are sort of partnering up here with Russia to get involved to further invade or keep, keep control of the situation in Syria. So it just makes for an interesting dynamic, is my point. But we're going to hope and we're going to pray for peace no matter where it is. And if we can make alliances or at least have a friendlier relationship with everybody around the world, that's a good thing. Because if it leads to less death, less war, less displacement, that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. Okay, so continuing here. For Turkey, it means retaining control over areas gained at the expense of the Kurds, while for Russia, its forces along for Russia, its forces alongside Syria's will oversee the rest. And that's a poorly written sentence they put here in the BBC. I'm going to have to send them a letter. Hours after the deal was announced, Turkey said there was no need to relaunch its offensive. That's a good thing. That's a good thing if Turkey is not going to relaunch its offensive. That's a good thing, which was on hold due to the ceasefire, which we talked about last week, as Kurdish fighters had withdrawn from the Turkish, quote, safe zone. So what was agreed? Turkey has seized about a 120-mile-long strip of land between the towns of Ras Al Ain to Tel Abyad to create a safe zone to resettle up to 2 million refugees currently in Turkey. 2 million refugees. That's unbelievable. Russia has agreed to allow Turkey's operation, removing the risk of conflict between the two sides. So we'll have to see how this moves forward. We do have al-Assad saying he is thanking President Putin and expressed his full support for the results of this work, and he seems to be fine with it. And that's probably because Assad and Putin are buddy-buddy. So now you're throwing Erdogan into the mix. And don't forget, because, it was maybe a podcast maybe a few weeks ago, maybe even longer than that already, where I said, be mindful of a potential alliance between Russia, Iran, Turkey, and China. And that was in regards to perhaps those nations forming a different payment system whereby they are going to accept other currencies for commodities as opposed to accepting U.S. dollars. So they might accept the Russian ruble or the Chinese yuan or the Turkish lira. And one of the reasons we said this is because we were noting a relatively known author and economist, Jim Rickards, who was floating this theory out there and saying, look, you have to look at the gold reserves of these countries, and they've all been aggressively building them up. So why would these countries, and why would the central banks within these countries, why would they be building up their gold reserves if everything's okay? If the global economy is perfectly fine, if a whole bunch of trade agreements are going to be agreed to, and you have all these central banks in these countries just, in complete control of their systems, why would they have to buy gold? What would be the purpose? Because you can't do much with gold except hold it, right? It's not paying a dividend. You can't eat it. You're not drinking it. Highly unlikely you're going to have enough to build a house out of it. Highly unlikely you're going to have enough to make clothes out of it. So what are you going to do with it, right? So it's sort of a head scratcher. But then when you think about it, maybe that's exactly what they're doing. So again, we're hoping and praying for peace and for stronger and better alliances, if you will. But there might be some funny business going on behind the scenes, too. So that's something to be mindful of. So don't forget that. And I know we cover a lot of information, and I'm sure you listen to a whole host of other news sources and commentary and read a whole host of articles from everybody. And that's a good thing. But, it's very easy to forget a lot of those details that we discuss here on a daily basis. So I do my best to sort of keep that in everybody's mind. But I think that one's an important one, especially if you do have an alliance between Turkey, Iran, Russia, and China, because those countries, pretty powerful countries, natural resources, heavy populations, strong militaries, nuclear weapons, you name it. So a lot of things to pay attention to. So moving onward with Brexit, and when will it end? And again, another article from BBC. You can check this out. Brexit bill in limbo as members of Parliament, MPs, reject the timetable. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has hit the pause button on his Brexit legislation after MPs rejected his plan to get it through the Commons in 3 days. MPs backed his withdrawal agreement bill, but minutes later voted against the timetable, leaving it in, quote, limbo. So that's what took place today. There was 2 votes that took place today, 2 big votes in the House of Commons. The first one, they actually passed, and Boris Johnson finally got a win in Parliament, where the members of Parliament voted to move forward with the withdrawal agreement bill that Boris Johnson had presented, that he got in that 11th hour with his counterparts within the European Union. However, there was a second vote that was put on the table immediately after that had to deal with the timetable as to when that bill would have been debated, voted for, and then basically trying to get a Brexit, a real Brexit, on October 31st. That vote got shut down, and that's what this article will talk about here as we make our way through. After the vote, EU Council President Donald Tusk said he would recommend EU leaders backed an extension to the 31st of October Brexit deadline. But Boris Johnson and a source within his government said if a delay was granted, the Prime Minister would seek an election. So a recap from last weekend. On Saturday, Mr. Johnson complied with a law demanding that he write to the EU to ask for a 3-month extension, but he did not sign the letter, which we mentioned. Following the result in the Commons, he said it was Parliament and not the government